Happy Sunday. I hope you're having a good day. I was wondering what to talk about today, and in my reflection, grief came up. Partly because grief is one of my favorite themes, and also I'm currently working with several individuals who are going through different types of grief. The reason why grief is my favorite subject, partly maybe that's my personality. I am drawn towards melancholic experiences, which I think due to my own childhood experience, including separating from my own parents when I was a child. But now I particularly reflect on the grief because I think grief is in the air that we breathe. It's one of the most human and common experiences, yet one of the most misunderstood themes at the same time. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive session or a monologue, but I just wanted to share a couple of things. The reason why I think it's one of the most misunderstood, or if not underrated, experiences is that we often associate grief with bereavement or significant major losses, like a loss of a relationship or loss of someone to death. But when I said grief is in the air, I think in a subtle ways we grieve yesterday or last year. We grieve our childhood. So it's much more than these peak experiences like loss of someone to death or loss of a relationship. So in that sense, it's a much more omnipresent experience than those peak experiences. But if we were to focus on those peak experiences like loss of someone to death and then subsequent bereavement or loss of a relationship and the heartbreak that comes after, loss of a dream, loss of a job, and loss of physical abilities due to sickness or accidents, loss of hopes, like in the form of losing your favorite candidate losing an election, or your favorite team losing a championship, things like that. These are all related to grief, which essentially involves that there is something that we thought we had or we ought to have, and we lost that, which triggers some sort of a void or a feeling of hollowness. Sometimes it can be felt quite physically. Because it's inherently unpleasant experience, we tend to avoid it altogether. And that's probably where these 5 stages of grief came up, which is kind of common knowledge now. So the denial is a common reaction because of the inherent pain associated with the loss. And that's understandable, and I think that's an important thing to recognize, especially when you access therapy or when you speak to other people about your loss, it is okay to accept, it is okay to expect a sense of denial and not wanting to talk about it right away. I think that's completely understandable. But when you prolonged that discussion, when you kick the can down the road without necessarily processing it, let's say after 2 years of that loss, that's probably not very helpful. So if you're still not willing to talk about it, let's say after 2 years from the loss, I would say that's a bit of a problematic position. So depending on your readiness, facing that pain of the loss is the key, is the crucial element of that puzzle, which is also the most common part that people tend to avoid because of the pain. Why it is important for us to process that? Because I think, with respect to all the grief schools of thoughts that have been there, I think they are quite accurate in terms of processing the feelings through those stages and slowly kind of moving on or moving forward. I think the reason for us to slowly come into face with the pain is because that's what makes us human. So grief is, in my view, is essentially a deeply human experience that we must make use of. So it's like almost like a heritage, because we are hardwired to bury our parents and stand on their grave and experience the sorrow and then build a life from that loss and around that loss. So depending on all the cultural expressions of grief, some form of experience of the pain, in my view, is essential. So when I work with someone who is grief stricken, the last thing I would do is to take away that pain. What I tend to do is to slowly, gradually expose them to that pain of the loss, because that pain is the key ingredient in that transformation, including the depression that must set in sooner or later. So it's very much like it reminds me of how my villagers back home produce this compost fertilizer. I remember my dad used to do that as well. So they would put hay and all these compostable material, and I remember accidentally jumping onto something like that and feeling this heat inside. Sometimes it almost can catch fire, and then they put water and it triggers some sort of a chemical reaction before all the material could turn into very valuable fertilizer that could help grow the crops. In the same way, I think experiencing that pain in smaller doses and experiencing the depression sooner or later is a key element of the grief, which is sometimes, for all the cultural reasons and And due to misunderstandings, we tend to take that pain away from the people who are grieving, thinking that that is the right thing to do, and therefore depriving them an opportunity not only to feel the grief but to grow from it. Because if you don't feel the pain, there you lessen your growth potential. So as much as we don't want to inflict further pain, we must be able to experience that pain. Especially when you do therapy, you can do it in carefully measured short dosages, so that you don't get overwhelmed and have a nervous breakdown or anything like that. But at the same time, you experience that pain, which essentially trigger an existential growth potential. Now in grief circles, there's a term for it. They call it post-traumatic growth. So there's no growth without the trauma or the pain. So in specific to grief, not just to general trauma, specific to grief, it's really important that we find a way to experience the pain in bearable doses and process it in a way that triggers that growth potential. It's difficult to tell what the growth potential look like for different individuals, but based on my own experiences and my experience with working with others who are grieving, some form of a growth potential is inevitable when you experience the pain and go through the depression. That growth potential kicks in. We don't know what that is. It's very different from individual to individual, but some form of growth potential is inevitable. In a way, I hope that gives you a sense of hope in the face of unbearable grief, when grief strikes you, because grief will strike you if you haven't already been stricken by it. So I do understand some people get paranoid or paralyzed by anticipatory grief. Even anticipatory grief can be felt and processed here and now. So I guess the underlying message today is to welcome grief, not only because it is an inevitable experience in our life. It is inevitable because it is designed to upgrade our existential human potential. So the more grief you experience, you're going to grow at least a couple of inches more spiritually and existentially at the end of that process. So this is something that I also take into account in my community sessions when I host community events, weekly community events in the Compassion Circle. And there's a dedicated space for grief and grieving. Whether you want to be a part of it, it's completely up to you, but I hope this would be a point of reflection for you when you are stricken by grief. Take care.